The satin stitch is a common go-to stitch whenever you need to fill in a large space in your embroidery. I'm going to show you how to do the satin stitch both on this straight section of the shape where my stitches are going to be going straight across like this. And then I'm also going to show you what happens when you want to do satin stitch along a curve. So as I work my way down this shape, I'm going to veer off over here to the left, and the direction of my stitches are going to change from going horizontal like this, and they're going to slowly start changing direction until they start going completely vertical by the time they get around to this side here. Now, when you are preparing to do a satin stitch, especially if your stitches are going to be changing direction, you could do something like I did here, which is to mark my stitches, the direction of my stitches lightly with a pencil or some kind of fabric marker. It doesn't matter too much if you make markings like that because this entire area is going to be completely covered with stitch work, and so none of those markings will show. To start my satin stitch, I'm not going to begin right at the very tip of my shape. I do that for two reasons. First, starting more in the middle helps me to make sure the directions of my the directions of my stitches keep going exactly in the right direction that I want them to go. The second reason is when you are working on tapering ends, tapering curves like this at the end of your satin stitch, it actually will look better if you work your way out towards that tapered end than if you were to start at the tapered end and then try to make your stitches longer and bigger as you work straight along. So to begin my satin stitch, I'm going to come up. I'm going to start on this second little marker line in that I made on my fabric. And I'm going to come up not right on the line itself, but rather just outside the line that I have drawn on my fabric. The reason for that is as the stitch gets pulled in tightly, I don't want any of my marking to end up showing on my finished embroidery project. And if you bring the needle up on the inside of that line or even just straight on the line itself, some of that ink edge will end up showing. So I'm just a hair to the outside of that line as I come up. I'll pull my thread all the way through, and then I just travel across to the other side of the shape, and then the same thing on the outside of my line, I'm going to go right back down again. Now, so I came up on the right, I went down on the left. Now I'm going to hop over and I'm going to come up on the right again of my shape. And I'm going to come up just a little bit, a few fibers up from where my previous stitch came up. So I don't want it to come up right at the same spot because then my stitches will end up just on top of each other. I don't want to be too far away from it because then I'll have a gap of fabric showing between my stitches. I want to really try to be right next to it, but with a few fibers of space still there in between my stitches. I come up like that. I hop right along to the other side. And then again, on the outside of the line that I have drawn, I go back down. And when I initially do that stitch, you'll see the thread, it may look like you can still see a little bit of that white fabric showing in between my stitches. Don't worry about that. When I do my next stitch, two things are going to happen. First, this stitch here is going to get pulled down a little bit more snugly. And second, as that stitch gets pulled down, the numerous threads I have, I'm using 3 threads in this particular demonstration, they're going to fan out a little bit. And so that way they're going to end up filling in that space a little better. So I come back over again, and just on the outside of my line, I come up, and then I jump ahead over to the other side, a few fibers over, and I go down again. The number of strands you decide to use in your needle whenever you're doing satin stitch depends really on a couple of things. It depends on how much detail you want there to be in your finished satin stitch project. It might depend on how complex, how many tight curves your shape has, and just how big the shape is. Fewer strands, if you're doing a satin stitch with just 1 or 2 strands, that'll work well on a very a very small shape or shapes that have very tight curves on them. Whereas using more strands, 3, 4, even 5 or 6 strands is good when you have a large space that you just need to fill in very, very quickly. Now, as I work my way, I'm gonna just switch gears here and let's look at the end of my curve, where the end of my shape is tapering off. The temptation for a lot of people who are new to satin stitch is to try to keep going smaller and smaller and smaller until you have a final stitch that's just a little teeny tiny dot of a stitch at the end. You do not need to do that. And actually, if you try to make a final stitch too small, that can end up puckering your fabric. So here, I'm actually only going to do 2 more stitches, and notice the length of these final stitches. So here, I'm still on the outside of my line. So let me pull this up so you can really see how far apart, how long that stitch is still going to be. And then my last stitch is right on top of the line that I had marked. And once again, look at this. You'll see there's still a decent amount of length between where the thread comes up and where it goes back down. But the end of my shape is not going to end up looking flat. It's going to have a bit of an optical illusion, and you can see here, where it still looks like a very nice circular arc going along the end of my shape. So now that I have made my way out to the end, I'm going to jump back and I'm going to start working in the opposite direction. So a couple different ways you could do this. You could just hop right on back and put the needle straight up without doing anything fancy there. I actually like to anchor my thread along the back side of my project. So I just slide my needle underneath the back side of my satin stitch work a little bit up to the point where I plan on continuing my work. That makes the back side look a little bit cleaner. And now I'm just going to continue right the way I did and moving in the opposite direction. Now sometimes, as I was talking about earlier, knowing how much space to leave between each of your stitches is something that comes with practice. And a common error is people who are new to satin stitch are more likely to make their stitches too bunched too closely together. You can get a little bit nervous about putting a few really good amount of space between where your last stitch was and your new stitch. So look here if you can. You can see there's a good stitch, thread width of space there between my last stitch and where my needle is now coming up. And that's still going to fill in very nicely when that stitch pulls down flat, because those threads are going to fan out because I'm using 3 threads here. You can see that still fills in very nicely. Sometimes though, if you're working along here and you accidentally make a gap that's too big, so let me show an example of this. Let's say I hopped over this far and pulled my needle down here. And let's say, oh no, I've made way too much space. There's a couple of options here. One, I could just pull that stitch out and then do a new stitch where it actually needs to be. Or if I've already stitched along too far and then suddenly said, oh, you know what, that gap there was bigger than I wanted it to be, one thing you can always do is just backtrack and put in a little filler thread. And that will be fine. You can get away with that with satin stitch, filling in accidental gaps. Like I said, that's not something you want to make a habit of, but in a pinch, it is an easy way to fix your stitch work. I've stitched ahead a little bit, and now I've gotten to the part of my shape where I need to be able to go around the curve. And what you'll notice here is the line on the inside of my curve is actually shorter than the line that I'm going to be following along the outside of my curve. So if I were to keep trying to just follow the lines directly with stitching the way that I have been going, then I'm not really going to get sharp enough of a turn in my thread, and it's not going to be able to make it all the way around to a full horizontal line here by the time I get to this end of the shape. So to fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my needle up, and I'm going to bring it up on the outer side, the longer side of my corner. And then I'm going to bring it up here, and I'm going to hop a few fibers over just like I would with a normal satin stitch, but I'm not going to put my needle down on the outside of the guideline there. Instead, I'm going to shorten my stitch and stop about 2/3 of the length of the rest of my satin stitches there. And that's where I'm going to pull that stitch through. Then I'm going to come back down and put my needle up at the bottom of my shape again. And this time, when I put my satin stitch back down, it's going to be going down on the line back a space. Right there. So instead of being a few fibers over from this short stitch, it will be a few fibers over from that previous normal length stitch. And so that means that that thread of mine, that stitch, is going to start turning this way a little bit. And I'll do that again with another stitch. I'll bring this up on the bottom of the shape. And when I put it down, I'm going to make a shortened stitch. And then I'll make a long stitch again. And you can keep going like that to make your way around a corner. Now at this point, I'm looking at this and I'm comparing it to my guidelines, and I'm not really turning fast enough around that corner. So to fix that, all I need to do is do more than one short stitch in a row. So here I'm going to make my short stitch. I'm going to come back up on the bottom outside the guideline. And then I'm going to make another short stitch that's even a little bit shorter than my last shorter stitch. Now I will come up and make a normal length stitch. And that helps to bring that corner around a little more sharply. There I have gone ahead and made my way all the way to the end. And there you can see the finished satin stitch.